Kenya's biggest conversation continues this hour, and we're looking at how Kenya can build weather-resilient buildings. And the Vice President of the Architectural Association of Kenya, George Arabbu, is our guest this morning. George, welcome once again.
Thank you very much.
Karibu sana. Okay, so even as we get into the conversation and asking ourselves the question, let's start from the top of this. And we said, yes, okay, weather affecting buildings in the country, weather, and when we say weather, when we talk about how architects and urban planners and construction look at some of these matters, why is it important to take the weather into consideration when it comes to infrastructure development in the country?
Yeah, first allow me to start by saying that we are highly informal when it comes to construction in this country. The government statistics themselves show that just less than 20% of our construction projects involve professionals. And at my association, the Architectural Association of Kenya, we have campaigns where we are trying to promote excellence, which we believe starts with, first of all, professionalizing the industry. This year we are currently looking at a campaign we are calling Mulika Mjengo, which is essentially something that is to highlight the issues and try to bring community to understand what to look out for, especially in what we would call informal construction. Never mind, they are everywhere. So in terms of why it's important, to consider the weather and, when you are looking at infrastructure, first we need to look at the patterns, the climatic patterns. The weather is the day-to-day, changes of the atmospheric conditions. But climate, you look at it in a matter of 30 years, or a period of 30 years, what has been happening, and also the fact that we are in a specific part of the world, the tropics, and we have specific experiences in weather. So when we are thinking about infrastructure, they are not just serving the urban network. They need also to be resilient, because we don't build infrastructure for one-off. We essentially build them for long term, and since it's a heavy investment, we want them to be as resilient as possible. And in most cases, if we consider things of climate change, if we consider things, for example, unpredictable heavy rains like this time round, you want to know that that design of the infrastructure has been made to the level where that adverse weather condition can actually, the infrastructure can withstand that. In fact, when engineers design, for example, they don't design for the least loading or the least stress that particular infrastructure will get. They design it where they look at what is the maximum possible stress that it can take.
Okay.
Yes.
So you talk about the vast majority of the construction taking place in the country today is informal.
That's right.
Right? So then that already begs a situation whereby nobody's really looking at taking these factors into consideration. A guy is looking at putting up, buildings, or looking at putting up the one-room kind of things that we see regularly in order to get people to move in, and then you can make your money. They're not really taking into consideration these things that you've talked about. So how can we introduce a system whereby resilient buildings are put up when that information is not being used? How do we do that when we already know that largely it is informal without the use of this information?
So of course, the most important bit is, how do you formalize the construction sector? First, we need to look at it from the perspective of where do we start when you are building. There is the scope of planning, where, for example, government is very much involved, and then based on policies, planning policies, and then enforcement, such that the government's role is to make sure that people build in the right place and the right way. Right now, the biggest challenge we have is that private development is much faster than the government can catch up when it comes to infrastructure. One, because a lot of our cities, and probably true across the world, is, I would say, more than 90% residential. For every 10 buildings you see in Nairobi, 9 is residential, and most of them have been developed by private developers who, following the informal route, have found ways of literally not abiding by the regulations, the planning ordinances, which essentially should tell you where to build, what to build, and how to build it. So for to answer your question directly, I think we need to first of all start with the aspects of planning, and most critical, how do we enforce the existing planning guidelines, and who does that? A lot of our local government, the counties, which are vested with the task of doing development control, don't even have the numbers. They don't have capacity, for example, to inspect. They don't have, I would even say, maybe the will to follow through what they approve. So that is what needs to be done. Then, of course, the developers can be reined upon to do the right thing.
If we take the view that the bulk of our population is in the rural areas, and I look at the buildings, let me talk about the houses I have in the rural areas. There was no government involvement.
Yes.
So you could argue, therefore, that most houses that are put up where the bulk of our population reside don't have any government say so. Now,
that is true.
So I'm talking relevance here. So now, government say so is important. I know that it's important. It's important in terms of planning. It's important for all these things. How do you bridge this gap? Because sometimes, in the absence of that, if it were to be followed to its true self, you prevent the sort of accidents that occur again from these same buildings, because these aren't highlighted as much as some of the houses we hear collapsing, say, for instance, in the cities. But houses do collapse in the rural areas. They are put up, and if you have a deluge such as the sort we're having now, one moment there's a house, the next moment there's rubble. So how do you bridge this gap?
So you're right. So a lot of the houses that have been built are actually in the rural areas, and there's also, the rural centers.
Yes.
In fact, the most critical situation happens where there's a lot of densification, especially in the small centers where there are very many houses built together. And in fact, most of these small centers, I'm intentionally looking at because all the rural areas we have small centers.
They will have small centers.
Which are the worst planned, because everyone builds there they want. There is no sewer, there's nothing, no water, nothing. And then you have this built up that is, so it's like we're creating a hard landscape. So when you create a hard landscape of roofs and paved areas and slabs and walls, you are actually creating a catchment for rain, which then when the rain comes there, it doesn't have a place to go because there is no infrastructure for it. Then you have all these pit latrines everywhere. So the government's role, first and foremost, is to define the policy and the planning guidelines. So even without enforcement, ideally, you as a builder in the village, you should either talk to the professionals, because if you talk to a professional, and I know there is always the argument about cost. If you talk to a professional, they are the ones who should interpret these guidelines and advise on both materials, local materials, advice on other things. For example, how do you build in the low-lying areas of, Kano, for example, such that when it rains, you can survive the house.
I laugh because I come from there.
Yes, all right. Great. And then you have a situation where we have a very short memory. As a community, we don't have a memory of saying, there used to be floods here, so I can build better. I don't know that you've been to Lake Baringo of late. There's a place called Soy Lodge.
Yes.
It's been flooded by the lake because the lake rose.
It's been submerged.
Submerged, actually, not even flooded. Submerged for a very long time. The entire ground floor and up to first floor has been submerged, and they've been closed, I think, for 4 years. Now, if you ask those old gentlemen there, they'll tell you they don't remember the last time the lake rose that much. That's why I started by talking about the climate conditions, because it's a long period of a pattern. Now, if we understand the pattern, we will build better, even without the government guidelines, because Yeah, sorry, Mark. I think you want to.
Yeah, Mark is itching.
I'm itching, and the reason I'm itching is you've gone into flooding around Lake Baringo, and that reminds me that every other day in Kenya we hear about tremors. So there's the issue that we live literally on a fault line, one of the biggest valleys in the world. We know we are geothermically exposed, and there's eruptions and things like that. Two, there's the fact of our nature of our soils, the black cotton soil in Karen, for example, not going too far. But then you're talking about places like Budalangi where flooding is common. But at the same time, you're talking about an ordinary Kenyan who does not even know that there is a code and a structure to how they should build. So my question to you is this: what have you done as a society, let me call it that, to nativize what you're saying, to make it native knowledge? So, for example, when my grandmother is putting up her grass-thatched hut, what information technologies have been made available to her at her level so that she can meet code at that level, instead of the expectation of her rising to both the intellectual and economic capacity to meet the requirements of the law or the requirements of architecture. So, for example, she has a mosquito net, right? She doesn't know how it's made. She doesn't know which chemicals are on, but she's been told if she puts it on, she will not get malaria and her grandson will be fine. How do we make that information native?
Because, if I can just jump on that, because the people in the rural area, which we've agreed, that's where the majority of population lives today. When we are putting up homes in the rural area, we are not inviting the expertise of a city architect or a city planner. It's the person who is in the area who has built a house before who's going to come and build it. So what basic information then should we have to make sure that indeed the buildings that are coming up in the country are weather resilient?
First, I need to own up, and it's an indictment actually, Mark, what you're asking to the profession. Majority of the professionals actually live in the cities, and that is unfortunate. In fact, if you look at the postal addresses of most architects, just Google it in our board of registration website, you'll just see half of them. I think more than half are in Nairobi, and the metropolitan areas, Kiambu, Kajiado, So the question is, how do we take this information to the grassroots? How do we work? How do the people build with our professionalism? Now, I think the most important thing for me to mention is this. First and foremost, we've lost how we used to build as a society. In fact, when you mentioned a grandmother, in my mind, the picture that came is my grandmother's house, which is made out of mud, the wall mud, sticks and mud, and smeared with cow dung.
Today.
Up to today. This was built, I think, in the early 70s, but it's still standing there up to today. We need to start interrogating, and I'm not evading your question, Mark. I'm going to address it. We need to start interrogating how we are building using, one, the new materials and the new technologies. What has happened is when we used to build with the old materials, we understood, for example, if you look at those houses, and I know it's a typical, if you picture the houses in the villages, especially in Western, if you come from Western part of Kenya, they have very low roofs and big overhangs of the mabati, such that it was known that if that overhang is big, it can stop the rain from getting to the mud.
Yes.
The house was also elevated from the ground, almost 2 feet or less, and it was built up such that when it rains, there's no water that come into the ground. And remember, even the floor is mud. These were houses that were designed for thermal comfort. Those houses were always naturally cool. Yes, and the trusses and everything was done of just gum poles, nothing special. Okay, even the mabati that was used, I think that time was a little bit higher gauge than what we are getting right now. Lots of very light gauge karatasi type mabati. So now you bring a very important question. How do we as professionals, thank you, get the information down? In fact, what I should be asking is, how do professionals go and learn how we used to build? Because we have what we call local materials. One of the biggest costs of any investment an individual makes in their life is building a house.
Yes.
Everything else, for a car, it doesn't matter. If you build a house, it's the most passionate, it's the most expensive. So how do you make it affordable? One, you have to use local technology, local materials, and local labor. There is no reason why professionals should be stuck in Nairobi. You know why? Because we are looking for flashy, high-rise, buildings and up, towers. Okay, when someone calls me to talk to me about architecture, they always assume that I've designed some high-rise apartment buildings in Nairobi. No one asks me about what I've built someone for a house in, I've ever designed someone a house in Siaya. I've done someone a house in Nyamira County. I've gone all the way to Mago. But that is not flashy enough for me to yes. Now, if we go down there, we can do a project, do it right, and then any local fundi, any local artisan will actually be able to learn. The transfer of knowledge is lacking because we think those small projects there are too time consuming, and then most of our clients don't actually pay. To be honest, even in Nairobi they don't pay. Let's start there. So they find a way of cutting shortcut. So it's a very vicious cycle where I feel like if I go there, I will waste my time. Okay, now, I'm not talking generally as a professional. I mean, personally, I don't mind. I actually find it more interesting when I go there and do a house from scratch and try to work around with the locally available material. And the worst bit about all this is that even thatch, today, there are no people who can thatch properly in Kenya.
What does that mean?
The grass roof.
No, I understand. I get what thatch is. What I'm saying is, when you say cannot thatch properly, are we saying that there was no transfer of knowledge?
Yes.
And skills. Or there was transfer of knowledge and skill from then till now?
Skill has been forgotten because the guys used to thatch. Slowly they were replaced by people doing mabati. So if you try to thatch right now, you'll be told you're in Mshamba. Okay, if you try to use brick, for example, fired brick, in Ushago, and this is, I can give an example of a house I've done in Siaya where, I went and we talked with the client and we agreed we'll do with the brick because we can get fired bricks. And he was convinced by his fundis that brick is matope and he's a big man, he cannot build with matope. So now, there are no people who can do good bricks.
You see, that's
because the people think it's backward.
Okay.
So you are going to import stones from Kedoa all the way, or other
because that's what you feel is better.
You feel that is a modern, permanent house.
Now, that's a bone I have to pick. Because one of the things, and there's a politician who likes to say this, and for me it rings true. We are African and Africa is our business. We have such a westward looking way of solving our problems, and we know historically there were entire mud wall cities in Africa, entire cities hosting hundreds of thousands of people. So this technology, because when I'm talking about building for the weather, I am thinking about the lady in the papers today who swam across a flooded area to go deliver a child. I'm thinking about that woman in the northern part of Kenya, in wherever part of Kenya, that needs to build a house that, based on what is available locally, what she can afford, and then also what can withstand the unexpected heavy rains, El Nino, which we postponed and brought back. Yes. How does she build that? Because the people in the city, I can fault them. They have chosen to scapegoat around the rules. The person in the village has no choice, has no knowledge, and in as much as we want to go back, your career has still not innovated for them.
Yes, one, it is important to acknowledge the fact that our profession has failed, and there are very good reasons why. One of them is, of course, numbers. We don't have numbers. In the whole of Kenya, we have about 2,000 architects, for example. I was just surprised the other day to learn that I think there are less than 200 surveyors in Kenya. I've gone to a county where we submitted buildings, architectural and engineering, And the engineering drawings were returned because we were told there is no engineer here. You go and build how you want.
What are you talking about? Oh, sorry. When you said 200 surveyors around the country, every time we hear surveyors are jumping up and down telling us, and all that noise is 200 people?
The registered ones. I'm talking about the registered ones who can, were professionally
who
liable.
have the legal authority
To survey?
Yes.
Okay.
Even the architects I'm talking about, majority of these 2,000 are not properly practicing. Occasionally you will not be able to, you will look at the register and you might see less than 1,000 registered at any one time. What Mark is talking about is that we have not been able to capacitate the builder, the entire built environment across the country. And the interesting bit about all this is that it doesn't mean there are no builders. It just means the builders who are wherever they are cutting corners. And to me, there is the modern information about how to build, but surely the old knowledge that we always build. And you mentioned the use of mud, for example, mud cities, like for example the Benin city, which was one of the most popular, probably well-planned city that most of Europe at the time when it was thriving.
Yes,
was done in Africa with native people. The stone walls of the Great Zimbabwe.
Yes.
A lot of Ethiopia, if you go to Ethiopia, even right now, there are castles that are still existing.
Yes.
Okay, Timbuktu. These are brilliant ideas. And even if you look at a Kawaida village, the way we do the concept of a courtyard with houses and then some fence around and then the granary in the middle and all that, these were houses that were not considered this thing of permanent house is very colonial, because when the colonialists came and they started building with stone, a lot of Kenyans who came to work in the cities and the servants for the white masters wanted to go back to the village and build with stone because they thought that was what was supposed to be done. But the guys who were building with this did not transition very well, and we as professionals have not been able to literally go there and get back into these things.
What would it take for the return of knowledge? Because this is what we're saying, that there came a time where new information, new knowledge was brought, but it didn't mean that the old knowledge was bad. And it didn't mean that there had to be a move. But here we are saying it's very clear that, look, we talk about Cement City. If an earthquake at the proportions that it happens in the east part of this world were to happen in this part of the world today, the devastation will be incomprehensible. That's just the truth. So where is this transference of knowledge today, whereby we're saying as we build, it doesn't matter where you are, rural Kenya, urban Kenya, wherever you are, that can we use material? Can people be advised to use material that no matter what happens, because we know, like Mark said, we know where we sit. Whether we're here, whether in West Africa, in southern part of Africa, we know where we sit and we know what is likely to or not happen with the weather. Where are we looking in terms of advice to say, build with this, build this way, let's go back? What's happening in that conversation?
Are
and how
we
should
even
it
teaching
our
students to think that way? Those in architectural school
today, can there be a different kind
those
of
who are studying
at the university level?
Yes, any discipline that's related to building. Are we training them to understand and think and go back into the history? You look at Spain and Portugal and you look at the architecture. The Moorish, these are Africans.
Yes.
And the influence. What they did was, over time, they evolved these things and owned them. And so one actually forgets. There are mentions that the Moors were here. But now us, who are living on this continent, are we actually training our people to understand that we actually had some serious stuff that needs to be understood in greater depth? And that is something you have to teach people so that they understand and get into it.
Are we?
Of course we're not.
The academic angle is very interesting. In fact, that is another lot of people, prof, who should be blamed, because I went through school and
prof didn't teach you.
We studied those things, but in a way that we were not. It's all like a token.
It was a unit that you had to pass.
Unit about traditional, the architecture of how we used to build, the forms, the shapes and everything, but we don't actually get to the level where can an engineer be taught how to build
again
with the bricks and mud. And we eventually we will get to a point where we will have to go back because the cost issues are there.
I think it's a very important conversation to have.
Yes,
My
that's right.
misery is that we couldn't continue this conversation even longer this morning. But thank you for being here, and let's mark it to do it again. Mark it.
Yes.
Thank you very much. George Arabbu
Thank
is the
you.
Vice President of the Architectural Association of Kenya. Thank you for being here this morning.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.